Hello, everyone. I am Dr. Jennifer Conzen, and I get the joy of presenting to you on a topic just dear to my heart. We're going to talk about God's plan for sexuality, redeemed sexuality in the midst of a countercultural conference, how to follow God's plan for sexuality. And it's such a joy to be with you. I have kids your ages that all of you that are sitting there. And so I couldn't desire more to be with an audience than to be with you. So, and you're in the midst of a really important conference overall. So let me share with you some things that I'm going to hit on tonight. I'm going to hit on the spiritual view of sexuality. I'm going to talk about family background and how it impacts sexuality. We're going to talk about some of the sexual challenges that come up with some of the things that happen in your background and upbringing that can very much influence the way you view sexuality and have experienced sexuality. We're going to talk about how do we as a family learn how to talk openly and honestly about sexuality. We are going to hit on sexual holiness, and then we'll end with how to have a full, rich, embodied living in the bodies that we are given. You're in the midst of a countercultural conference, and I want to hit a couple things that I think are vital to understand about sexuality in that way. Jesus was countercultural, including in how he interacted around gender and how he interacted around and taught around sexuality. At the time, he was treating women in ways that nobody in his culture treated women. He did talk openly about sexuality, and how he treated people who were caught in sexual sin was definitely countercultural. Paul was countercultural. In his writings, he actually talked about women and women's roles in ways that nobody at his time was talking about women. And Paul and Jesus were both single, and they wrote all this stuff that actually they're the two main writers on sexuality. And they were both not married. The Bible is countercultural when it comes to sexuality, and some of the writers about it were very countercultural, definitely for their time. The thing for you is that when your basis of living your life is on the scriptures, sometimes you're going to fall on the conservative side, which is more the dominant narrative. That's a term that's used in psychology. Sometimes you're going to fall more on the liberal side, the more countercultural side. Using the scriptures as your basis, sometimes you're going to be one, sometimes you're going to be the other. We need to be willing to be wrong, including around sexuality. The work I do is countercultural. Being somebody who works in mental health within our family of churches, that can go against the culture of the church. Working in sexuality, I get asked, how did you do that, becoming a sex therapist as a disciple? I'm like, right? That's a good question. We don't often talk about these things openly in our family of churches. We're learning to, but it is countercultural, and it's countercultural not just in the rest of the world, even here in the United States, having open, honest conversations around sexuality. And then definitely having boundaries around sexuality, having strong convictions about what you will and what you will not do sexually is against the culture, is countercultural in some societies, including here in the United States. So what we're doing tonight is countercultural, talking about sexuality. I would say that one of the things I want to emphasize tonight, you might have thought, oh, here's another lesson on sexuality. We're going to be talking about purity. But there is a difference between talking about purity and talking about sexuality. I actually got to speak at a conference in Denver a few years ago, and the topic that I proposed was how to teach your kids about sex. And I got to the conference, and the name of it on the flyer said how to teach your kids about sex and purity. And I was like, oh, we are so funny. We can't just talk about sex. We have to talk about sex and purity. Like, purity is vital. It's all over the scriptures. We need to absolutely shoot for holiness and purity. However, often we've made that word so dirty and so negative. I do want to emphasize that today we're going to talk about sexuality. I'm going to hit on holiness, but our goal is to talk about the overarching view of sexuality biblically. In the back of my book called Redeemed Sexuality is a paragraph I want to read to you. You are a sexual person. God created them, male and female. As a single professional, for those of you who are that, campus student, for those of you who are that, teen, married man or woman, from conception, God, the master artist, created you as a sexual being. So, how do you live out your sexuality in a way that's honoring to God? And what is sexuality? Is it just intercourse? Or is it perhaps something much greater? That's what I want to examine tonight. How do we live out our sexuality? You're a sexual being. You were made that way. How do you steward and live out your sexuality in a way that's honoring to God? First of all, what I want to examine is, what do the scriptures teach? What is a spiritual view of sexuality? If you get a chance, go take a nice long look at Ezekiel 16 and Ezekiel 23. And what you'll see is God's talking to the nation of Israel, and he's sharing with them, well, he's challenging them, he's rebuking them about their idolatry, that they are worshiping other gods. Well, God uses sexuality to share with them what that's like for him, that they are committing idolatry. He uses the language of adultery to express how he feels about their idolatry. Why does he do that? I'm a marriage and family therapist. I work with a lot of couples, and one of the greatest pains, the greatest pain that couples share with me is when there's been some kind of betrayal. You may have been in relationships where that happened to you, where there was a betrayal in that relationship. It's incredibly painful. God uses our understanding of that and says, that's how I feel when you worship other gods. So God here in Ezekiel 16 and 23, he uses really explicit sexual language to share with us his heart. God uses sexuality so that we can actually know him better. We tend to think of sexuality as, here's God and here's sexuality, and those two things never meet. But that's not how it is in the scriptures. God actually uses sexuality to show us his heart. And it's amazing the other ways we know this. For instance, if you look at Matthew 1, in verse 25, it says that Joseph did not have relations with Mary until she gave birth to Jesus. What it actually says in the Greek is, Joseph did not know Mary until she gave birth to Jesus. That word is gnosko. Joseph did not gnosko Mary, is what it actually says in the Greek. Well, that word gnosko, it's actually used in John 10, where Jesus says, I know the Father and the Father knows me. I know the sheep and the sheep know a voice. I gnosko the Father. I gnosko the sheep. This word gnosko means a deep, intimate knowing. So how well does Jesus know God? Well, Jesus is God, so he knows him pretty well. How well does God know us? Well, he created us while we were in our mother's womb, so he knows us pretty well. That word gnosko means a deep, intimate, experiential knowledge of the other person. That's the word that God uses to describe Joseph and Mary having sex. That it's not just about orgasm. It's not just about the act of sex. It's about a deep, intimate knowing. It's reflected in Genesis 4, where it says that Adam knew Eve and she conceived and gave birth to Cain. It's a word in the Hebrew yada. That word yada, guess what it means? It means a deep, intimate knowing. It's used in Jeremiah and many other places where God says, I will know you. You will know me. That deep, intimate knowing, just like the word gnosko, is used to describe sex between Adam and Eve. So these two prominent couples in the Bible, Joseph and Mary, Adam and Eve, the word God uses to describe them having sex is this word deep, intimate knowing. We tend to think that the Bible, that God are sex negative because the majority of the scriptures are about what not to do, what sins not to commit. Don't have sex with your aunt or a dog. Like the Bible clearly says what not to do sexually over and over and over. But the scriptures that do describe how sex should be are deeply positive. That it should be this, when it comes to erotic sexuality, when two people are actually having intercourse, the word that describes it is this deep, intimate knowing. There are some other words that the Bible uses to describe sex that unfortunately in our campus and singles ministries, we often don't talk about. So when you look at Proverbs 5, it says, may you be intoxicated with her love. And it's actually talking to a husband about how he views his wife's breasts, and that it causes him to feel intoxicated. In other words, when he looks at the sexual parts of her body, it makes him feel like the word literally means reeling around drunk. So God lets us know right there in Proverbs 5 that sex should be so fantastic, it makes you feel like you're intoxicated. In 1 Corinthians 7, it says that the engaged man, if he is burning for passion towards her, he should go marry her. Well, this word here is Puroo, P-U-R-O-O, which means set on fire. So it describes sexuality as this burning, passionate fire. And he says, if that's how you're feeling, then go marry her. In other words, take that burning and put it into marriage. That's what sex is supposed to be like in marriage, this burning, intoxicating. In Proverbs 5 and in Song of Solomon 4, it uses some other terms. And these are mostly water terms. It describes sex as a cistern, as a fountain, as a flowing spring, and as a well. These refreshing, flowing waters. So the Bible uses these incredibly powerful, positive terms to describe the sexual relationship. And what's interesting is most of the time we just talk about the do's and the don'ts of sex and the sin that we get caught into. We need to make sure we're understanding how the Bible defines sex. And when it does define it, it's very positive with these beautiful terms. In fact, the Bible is the only world religion text that has an entire book dedicated to sensuality and sexuality. A lot of times in our singles and campus ministries, we tend to tell people not to read Song of Solomon. And I'm like, now wait a minute. People are watching all these shows with sexuality in it, and they've been dealing with pornography, and they're reading books, and sexuality and is all over the place. We need to read God's book, God's movie. Song of Songs is God's beautiful picture of how sex should be. Go read it. Go learn God's view of sexuality. We also know that deep, intimate knowing of God, it will guide and guard our sexuality. In Romans 1, it says that God gave them over to the sinful desires of their hearts to sexual impurity for the degrading of their bodies with one another. They exchanged the truth of God for a lie. They didn't think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, the gnosko of God, and he gave them over to a depraved mind. So our gnosko of God will keep us from sexual impurity and degrading our bodies. And this isn't, again, this is the deep, intimate knowing of God. This isn't, I go to church, I read my Bible. This is, I know his heart. I know his character. I know who God is. If we have that kind of knowing of God, that can guide and guard our sexuality. In 1 Thessalonians 4, it says that the heathen who do not gnosko, who do not know God, give their bodies to sexual immorality. Our knowledge of God can guide and guard our sexuality. You know, I shared with you a bunch of terms that the Bible uses, that it's intoxicating, that biblical sexuality in marriage creates this wonderful, refreshing, burning, intoxicating feeling. But I have to tell you, when I'm teaching married couples in our family, our spiritual family, our church, they're not often experiencing sexuality with those words. We tend to think, oh, once somebody gets married, that's how it'll be. Often the reason why people aren't experiencing it that way is because they never learned it, even before they got married, that that's God's intention for sexuality. So for you, while you're single, learn God's intention for sexuality. The Bible is very sex positive. So as a church, often we tend to address sexuality pretty much only when sin is involved. Like I said, even the title of the lesson that I taught, we tend to avoid, though, talking openly and honestly about masturbation, pornography, same-sex attraction. We lack the teaching about the positive things that God says about the relationship. And we tend to instead have a list of do's and don'ts. Don't wear this, don't say this, don't watch this. Do I think God intends us to have healthy boundaries around sexuality? I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Yes. But when all we do is teach what not to do, and we don't teach what God does intend, it skews our view of sexuality. The other thing that really comes up is that people feel a lot of shame and guilt around sexuality, either because of what happened to them in their background or what they did in their background or the way they think and feel or things that they're struggling with. We need to talk openly and honestly about the shame that people often feel around sexuality. Even if they haven't engaged sexually, the fact that they don't talk about it openly in their families growing up gives this idea that sex is dirty and negative. And so that shame can just be there because we don't talk about it openly. We need to discuss how we view sexuality. And we need to really make sure that when we are talking about sexual sin, that how we respond to one another is with mercy and grace. We tend towards shaming people for their sexual sin. And that's so different from what you see in the scriptures. In Deuteronomy 22, God clearly states that if a man and woman are engaged in sex before they're married, you take them outside this town and you stone them. Okay, it's in Deuteronomy 22. Well, in John 8, God walks on stage. And we see how he lives that scripture out. In John 8, the Pharisees bring before Jesus a woman caught in adultery. And he says to her, after they all leave, he says, "Did anyone condemn you?" She says, "No." And he says, "Neither do I condemn you. Now go live your life of sin." The God of the Bible, who wrote Deuteronomy 22, lived out how to put it into practice in John 8. Here's a woman caught in adultery, and he says, "I don't condemn you." And he tells her very clearly, go live your life of sin. Do we need to confront sexual sin? Sure. But we need to do it with grace and mercy, the way that Jesus does, the way that God does. Now, we've looked at an overarching teaching on sexuality in the Bible, just briefly. And now I want to really talk about what influences our views about sexuality and our development of sexuality. There's a lot of different factors in our family upbringing that impact it. I mentioned earlier that the lack of talking openly about sexuality influences how people view sexuality and how they view themselves as a sexual person. Often families have not had the birds and the bees talk at all, or if they do, it's just like, here's a book, or so how was that class you went to? Or they might have a one-time discussion about it, but that's the only time they've ever discussed it. So the lack of talking openly about sexuality in families creates a taboo around sex and creates a sex is dirty and shameful and we don't talk about it. Also, that happens not just around the birds and the bees talk, but it also happens around puberty. It's not uncommon where young women, their mom didn't even talk to them about what happens when they have a period, about how to choose a bra. So their developing body that goes through puberty, they never talked about that. Or young men who are having nighttime emissions and having arousal and feeling the desire to touch themselves. There's nobody in their family to talk to about it because we don't talk about those things. And so arousal and what to do with arousal doesn't get talked about in families. Also, families don't talk about sex outside of marriage or about pregnancy, what to do with arousal, same-sex attraction. The lack of talking openly and honestly really impacts the way people view sexuality. I did a research study of married women and shame with sexuality, and every one of the women in the research study, they associated feeling shame about sexuality with the fact that in their families they didn't talk about it openly. So the lack of talking openly is directly correlated with shameful feelings, even in adults who are married. Also, in your family of origin, you may have been exposed to sexuality in a way that is what I would call exploitative or dehumanizing. In other words, if you were at those early ages exposed to pornography or lewd jokes around sexuality, or you were touched in violating ways, or you saw people be assaulted sexually, if you were exposed to immoral sexuality all around you, that will influence how you view sexuality as an adult, how you view even godly sexuality as an adult. And then definitely as you were growing, it's not uncommon for young children to touch themselves for various reasons as they're developing. How your family responded to that, don't touch that. That's never put your hands down there. If there's this kind of rejecting response when a child does explore themselves and touch themselves, that can then say, I'm dirty, that part of my body is dirty. And then definitely if there's been any kind of violating touches, sexual abuse, sexual trauma, and it can include even simple, the word simple is probably not the right word, but even one-time touches where I had a client who, her father, one time and never repeated it, put his hands down his daughter's underwear and grabbed her buttocks. She was molested one time, and it sent her views of sexuality on a certain trajectory. So violating touches can be sexual trauma that is penetrative sexuality, but can also be a one-time violating touch. So that will influence how someone views sexuality, and also how the important people in their life respond if they've been assaulted and they go and tell mom, and mom goes, well, what did you do that made him do that? Or Uncle so-and-so wouldn't do that, honey. So if someone does share with a caregiver about an assault and then they are dismissed or disregarded, that will very much affect how they view sexuality. And then definitely media and how media portrays sexuality has a huge impact on our developing sexuality and how we view it. I mean, if you think about it, TV and movie shows, how do they portray? Who's having sex in those shows? Well, it's usually on a first date. It's almost always premarital. And then the sex scene itself, they're panting and they get shoved up against a wall and have sex against the wall, or they get thrown in bed and the clothes are being ripped off and they both have orgasms at the same time and there's never any erectile dysfunction or vaginal pain. These pictures of this is how sex works, and especially how pornography makes sex work, they're not realistic. This is not what it looks like. And yet, for many of us, that's what we think sex is like because we've seen it in that show. We've seen it in that movie. We've watched it in pornography. Media does not portray sexuality accurately. So we often have to relearn a godly view of sexuality and recognize the ways we're influenced by the things that we've heard either growing up or through many different media outlets. There are other things that also influence the development of sexuality, and definitely how we experience gender and how we experience attraction. That will develop over the years. I don't have enough time tonight to go into the development of same-sex attraction, but I would say, if I was with you in a group, I would say, everybody raise your hands who has heard Guy Hammond speak, and then who of you here has read his book, Caring Beyond the Margins? And what I have found is that only a small percentage of the audience raises their hand when I say, have you read his book? I'm glad you've heard him speak, but if you have some questions about the development of sexuality when it comes to gender and same-sex attraction, go read Guy Hammond's book, Caring Beyond the Margins. I highly recommend it. Go do that so that you can get a thorough understanding of that area of the development of sexuality. There are a number of other factors that influence how you view sex. How you experienced touch in your family background and as you developed, not just violating touches, but even just touch overall. One of the things that comes up is that often families either are not affectionate, they don't hug, they don't exchange affection in any way. That influences how people view close, intimate relationships. And it definitely influences how they view sexuality. Definitely, if that touch is violating, it affects it. But even the lack of affection, one thing that often happens is that there's a withdrawal affection during puberty. So I've had moms in workshops that I've done that have said, my son is 13, he still likes to put his head in my lap. He's now 13 and, his head is kind of near my vulva. Should I not have him lay that way? So this is a mom not sure, should I still be affectionate in this way? Dads who have teenage daughters aren't sure if they should hold them on their laps any longer. And, they're developing bodies. So parents can become uncomfortable with the developing body during puberty and withdraw affection. And this young person is saying, what's wrong with me? So affection and the lack of it or problems with it can affect how people then engage in intimate relationships as they mature. Definitely, some people just don't even enjoy touch from when they were little. That will affect the development of sexuality. The thing I want to emphasize is that healthy, warm, loving touch is really important. We actually know it has health benefits and mental health benefits. And the thing is, look at Jesus. He touched people. He healed so many different people, and we know he didn't need to touch them in order to heal them because he could literally, from one town to another, never seeing somebody, send the vibes through the air and heal a person. And yet, the majority of the time, he's touching people. He didn't have to. He could have healed them without it. Jesus was about touch. Even when Peter starts to sink in the water, Jesus reaches out his hand to lift him into the boat. Well, Jesus could have done the whole Star Wars thing and got him into the boat, but he didn't. He reached out his hand, and you see that over and over. We need touch. I call it skin hunger. Our bodies need touch. So actually, talking about sexuality needs to be in the greater context of talking openly about touch and affection. In our singles and campus and teen ministries, we need to talk about affection. We need touch. So I would say in your ministries after this lesson, in your D times, talk about it. There's another piece that highly impacts the development of sexuality, and that's body image. If you grew up in a family in which there was negative comments about the body, about weight, or about how you were developing or not developing, parents might make comments about your body or about your musculature or lack of musculature. People might make comments all the time about how they're on diets or they're bulking up. So how families discuss the body or make negative comments about other people's body hugely impacts how someone sees their own body, and that impacts sexuality. I had a woman I worked with where her father would put her obese sister on a scale in front of the whole family, shaming her, right? Well, the sister who watched all of this over and over, she actually became anorexic, and she was always negative about her body, always wanting to cover it up. And she dealt with anorexia for a couple decades. She's a faithful disciple married to a loving, faithful husband. And yet even today, she shared with me that she doesn't feel comfortable being naked in front of her husband, who loves her, who's super positive. So that early experience around the body hugely affects your sexuality. Now, body image has a big impact. And definitely how media portrays the body, super problematic. Body image has a big impact on how people's sexuality develops. We need to learn to talk openly and honestly around the body. Let me read some words to you. Toe, forehead, eyebrow, kneecap, teeth, kidney, throat, lungs, mouth. Okay, those are parts of your body. I'm going to read some more. Clitoris, vulva, penis, vagina, scrotum, breasts, semen. Those are also parts of your body. You know, probably when I read the second list, some of you started to go, and get uncomfortable, maybe start giggling, maybe look around the room. I'm actually saying the word clitoris and the word penis in a mixed room with men and women together, or at least you're all watching this online together. So the reality is we get really uncomfortable around the sexual parts of the body, but we don't get uncomfortable when we say kneecap and kidney and tooth. We need to learn that God made every part of our body, and it's amazing. Every single part of our body. The eyeball is amazing, and so is the penis and the vagina. You know what the Bible actually says? It says, I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. That means every part of your body, and it also means your penis, your vagina are fearfully and wonderfully made. So let me describe what I mean by that. When a person thinks a thought, or a flash of a picture comes before their eyes that is sexual in nature. You're watching TV and some ad comes up, or an aroused feeling. You just feel an aroused feeling, or a slight touch causes an aroused reaction. You will get a blood flow that comes to the penis and the vulva. It's a God-given, amazing natural response. God made this response that blood flow would come to your genitals to get you ready to have sex, to create an erection and to create a throbbing and tingling in the vulva. It's getting your body ready to have sex. When that happens, what if we were to go, wow, God did such an amazing job making my body, every part of my body. Now, when that happens, and maybe you're getting that aroused feeling because you're watching pornography or reading a book that's sexual. So I'm not talking about that when you're doing things that intentionally get that response going. I'm talking about the natural response of the body that just sometimes happens out of the blue. Well, that blood flow to the vagina and to the penis is actually controlled by the lower spine. It's not controlled by the brain yet, that initial response. It's an automatic response of the body controlled by the lower part of the spine. In other words, like when you go see the doctor and they do they have you put one knee over the other and they use the little mallet and go boink, and your knee goes woo, your foot kicks up. They're checking that knee-jerk reaction to see if your lower spine, they're checking your automatic responses in the lower spine. Well, those responses are that part of your spine is what controls that blood flow. So when that blood flow happens, instead of having a shaming response, what if we go, wow, it works. Didn't God do a great job with my body? And now I'm going to steward that response with what I believe. That my beliefs are, I'm not going to engage in stimulating that response and doing it to orgasm. I'm not going to go and watch pornography or touch myself to get aroused. But I'm going to accept the fact that this is what my body does, be amazed by God's creation, and then I'm going to choose to go for a walk, talk to a friend, send an encouraging text to someone. I'm going to use the values about how I want to live my life to decide what to do with that arousal, being guided by my beliefs and my values. But that is rooted in accepting how amazing of a job God did in making every part of our body, the kneecap, the eyeball, the vagina, the penis. God did an amazing job. We need to have a positive view of the body. And then we can steward our sexuality the way God intends. Should we pursue holiness? Yes. Should we pursue purity? Yes. I would say we need to start first with redefining purity. We tend to think of purity as, okay, bro, I really blew it in my purity today. Like, as if purity is like this like negative word that we're depriving ourselves of something and it's negative. Instead of seeing it as this incredibly awesome thing. If you're an athlete and you go running and then someone hands you a cold bottle of water and you drink it and you're like, that's so refreshing. That's actually the type of language that the Bible uses to describe purity. In Philippians 2, one of the word purity there, it literally means a being shined on by God, a light from heaven. Purity is a beautiful thing. So often we have to redefine it and see it not as a negative. And then we also need to be able to talk openly and honestly. So let's mention that. Talking openly and honestly about the use of pornography is vital. And we tend to think that it's kind of a guy thing, and women don't struggle with this. And we have men's purity groups, we don't have women's purity groups. Sexual responses and the draw to go and read and watch is a male and female thing. We do need to talk about it openly and honestly in all of our ministry. And it's interesting, in James 1, it says that by a man's evil desires, he is dragged away and enticed, and it gives birth to death and then to sin. That scripture, we tend to talk about sin, about the death and the destruction part, but we don't talk about, he says that he's dragged away and enticed. Sexual sin, we need to find out what's the enticement, what's the pull, what's the draw. For some people that I work with, the reason why they end up using pornography is they've gotten in a really sinful habit, yes, but they get a stressful email and then they click on pornography. What is drawing you? What's the trigger? We need to talk openly and honestly about the pulls and the triggers, not just about when someone blows it, but what's the pull? We need to find ways to make it okay to have these discussions. The other thing I would highly recommend in dealing with purity is have a plan on what to do with those pulls. When you're pulled, what do you do? In Matthew 12, Jesus talks about the guy who cleans out his house and then 7 more demons come live in it. And he's like, you left the house empty. And so demons came in. Often what we do in dealing with purity is we get rid of it. I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to do this. I'm going to clean my house out. But then we don't fill our house up with good things. You need to have a plan with how to clean out the house, yes, but then how to fill it up with good things. So what is your plan? Most people that come to see me, I'm an addiction specialist, and they come to see me for all kinds of different types of addictions. But often they only have a plan for when they blow it. They don't have a plan for the pulls, for the triggers. Like when I'm anxious, do I have a plan on what I'm going to do so that I don't end up using? When I'm sad, when I'm bored, do I have an action plan for those times? So let me make some suggestions on how to put together an action plan. Yes, put protections on your devices, sure. Gain a godly view of sex, like the first part of this class. Have a solid plan for each thing that is a trigger for you. When most people use pornography when they're alone, when it's late at night, do you have a plan for what to do? Plan ahead of time. When you do feel aroused, go through what I just walked you through. Wow, that's amazing. And have a plan with what you're going to do with it from there. What are your values and how do you live them out? And then live a full, rich, embodied life. Let me tell you what I mean by that. I use the term embodied living. When people are desiring to live a chaste, celibate life, they need to figure out how to live out a full, rich life in the bodies they're given. In 2 Corinthians 4, it says the body is for the Lord. And in 2 Corinthians, it also says the life of Jesus is manifested in our bodies. In the book that I just love, it's called Earthen Vessels by Matthew Anderson. He says the God of the universe lives in our hearts and in our limbs. Our current culture says that it's your body, and as long as you don't harm anybody else, you can live however you want to live. But that's actually not what the scriptures teach. The scriptures teach that our body is to be used for God. So how do you live out your life fully and richly? Well, one of the things that happens is that when people feel a sexual pull, they think that's what they need is sex. But actually, a good chunk of the time, the real need is they need connection with someone. They need to relax. They need a relief from stress, but they've gotten in a pattern of doing something sexually to relieve that need. They've just gone down this path so many different times. I would say, instead of following that path when you're stressed, need relaxation, and need to rest, find life-giving, renewing ways to live in this amazing body that God made you. So find good, robust ways to live bodily. It's so important. Go dance, go hike, I live in San Diego, play in the ocean. If you live in Denver, go play in a river, hug your friends, feel that water on your skin, go do yoga, go help someone build a house. Well, make sure that everybody's doing good COVID things. Enjoy a softball game and a soccer game, ride a bike, go paint, go hug that friend again. Turn on the music and dance, climb a mountain, hike to a waterfall. An incredibly important part of maintaining a celibate life is living passionately in the body you have. Why should you flee sexual immorality? Why should you live in that body the way God intended you to? In 1 Corinthians 6, it says, you were bought at a price. Offer the parts of your body, Romans 6 says, to God as instruments of righteousness. Why? As those who have been brought from death to life. You were created with an amazing body. When's the last time? Remember, it says that you were fearfully and wonderfully made, that scripture we looked at? That word fearful means the same way that you would say that you look at God, that you're looking at him with fear and trembling. Oh, that's how we're supposed to look at our bodies. When's the last time you looked at your mirror when you're changing and you're naked and you went, wow, oh, look how good God did at making my body. And now I'm going to go live in that body in a way that is renewing and full and rich, instead of following paths that the world says to follow sexuality in ways that God never intended. That ability to root how you live in your body is rooted in how you view yourself. There is a set of scriptures I use about how God feels about you. You know the words that God uses to describe you? He calls you precious, beloved, treasured, chosen, a jewel, an apple of his eye. How you live out your life bodily is going to be really reflected in how well do you know how God feels about you. And in fact, if you want that list of scriptures I'm telling you, you can email me, jenniferconson@yahoo.com. I have a list that I've put together over 30 years on how God feels about us. We need to root our sexuality, remember, in who God is, in deeply knowing him, deeply knowing his character, and deeply knowing his heart. It has been lovely to be with you. I'm praying for the conference that all of you will be growing deeply and enriched. Please feel free from anything that we've discussed today to write to me with any of your questions. jenniferconson@yahoo.com. It has been wonderful to be with you. Bye-bye.